This conference will now be recorded.
Or you can type something in the chat to get our attention. Okay, not hearing any announcements and staff report. I have one announcement. Last week I did attend the city council meeting. Michael did attend as well. I don't know if anyone else got a chance to tune in, and Paul also. City council is happy for an update. They were curious about our schedule as well as how we're kind of vetting the different items that we've been working on. They seemed pleased that we and staff have reached out to some of the other committees for input. And I know Paul had some updates on that in his staff notes. The council did seem very interested in us targeting a May completion of our current work. But, you know, they do know that they want it like vetted and working and all of those things. So they are interested in having an update from us in April on kind of how things are going, so that then they're kind of better informed as the interim zoning period ends in kind of the beginning of May. So that was generally the update. They didn't have a lot of specific feedback other than you know, they've liked how we've vetted things in the past and are hoping we're doing similar for these items we're working on. We did also talk a little bit about the Chapter 12 items and whether some of those Chapter 10 and 12 items might be done kind of on a different or faster timeline than some of the PUD work. And I told them that so far we've been working on everything as a package, but you know, we can kind of reevaluate where we're at with all of our work kind of prior to getting back to the city council in a few months. So.
Jessica, you had a question from Michael, looks like.
Oh, Michael?
Yeah, it was actually a question about Paul's memo. He says he's going to meet with Parks and Recs on February the 18th, but I think that might be a misprint.
Indeed, that was a misprint. It was February the 22nd. It was last night that I met with them.
Oh, okay.
So had a good meeting with them, just briefed them on where things were. They were generally quite excited to see that some of the things that had gone into the open space report way back in 2014 were finally getting incorporated as part of the PUDs. And I'm going to go back to them next month with some specifics. Date to be determined, but I'm happy to let commissioners know, and anyone would love to have any commissioner who's able to come with me.
Great. Any other announcements from anyone? Duncan?
Yeah, just real quickly, I attended the second meeting of the Swift and Spear Street Intersection Commission last Thursday. And the firm that's doing the consulting presented a sort of info sheet that they're going to put out to the public about the intersection, traffic at different times, turn rates, all sorts of different stuff. The idea of it being that the public could take a look at it, and then there's a survey at the end that they could respond to. Do they use the intersection? How do they use it? And I believe that they hope to present to us, the Planning Commission, at one of our later March meetings. I know that you're going to talk about that later, Jessica, but just wanted to let people know if anyone has any more on that, just let me know.
Great. Michael?
Just a quick question for Duncan. Was a roundabout one of the things that was discussed?
They did show that was looked at back in, I think, in 2004. And the only part of the conversation that really talked about that was that the criteria have significantly changed since then for a roundabout. So I don't know that it could still be in the works. I'm not sure. It's still in the preliminary phase, but they did show that, I think it was from 2004, they had done a study that looked at a roundabout. But obviously the traffic count has increased quite a bit since then.
Great. Yeah, so we'll kind of include that in our discussion of the schedule at the end of the meeting as well. Anyone else? Anything else from you, from staff, Paul?
Just a couple of things quickly. A reminder that next Monday is the pre-town meeting day public meeting. So all are welcome to come and listen and learn about the school budget and the city budget. And I believe that then, as with each year, there will be a debate amongst the candidates where there's opposition, where there's multiple candidates for the same position for the school board and city council. And last Friday, I participated in a meeting, an update to the regional bike share program. It's been a slow and meandering path for the last little while of efforts to move the bike share over to electric assist bikes. And for the first time in about, probably a year, we had some positive news that looks like there might be a little bit of traction of replacing the fleet with electric bikes. Not surprisingly, the data has shown lots of people like to go down the hill. Very few people like to go up the hill between Burlington and South Burlington. So, but with the e-bikes, that would change some of that, and there would be potentially a couple of additional sites in South Burlington too. So hopefully in about a month, I'll have more exciting news to share with you on that.
Michael?
One last question. Are we going to talk about the new schedule of meeting every week starting March the 3rd, I guess it is?
So it's actually on the agenda item number 8 under other business. So yes, people can think about that idea between now and then. Okay, anything else? Okay, so I sent by email for number 4, just looking at our meeting participation guidelines. Paul, it might make sense for one of us to share this. I can't share the screen the way I'm right now. So if you had it, you could bring it up, or everyone. So for members of the public, I apologize. This is something I sent directly to the commissioners just yesterday. It kind of was brought to my attention that our meeting participation guidelines that we have as the second page of each of our published agendas for the public participation is very specific to in-person meetings. And we've been meeting virtually now for a long time. I also thought it might be nice to give kind of our planning commissioners some general guidelines on how to participate. The virtual format's just very different. So I sent a draft of both of those sets of guidelines to commissioners yesterday, just as something to look at. The planning commissioner member participation guidelines, we've never had those before, and I think we as a group could choose to actually officially adopt something that we would each try to kind of strive to maintain ourselves within, or we can just kind of look at it and generally agree. I don't think it's something we have to officially adopt, but I do think that either tonight or if we want to give the public a chance to look at it and comment, I do think we should adopt revised public participation guidelines. So what Paul has up on the screen is the member meeting participation, and a lot of this is really pretty straightforward. I think all of us generally try to do a lot of these things. I just thought it might be nice to kind of lay something out for people to take a look at. I think a few of the items I just wanted to point out. I know sometimes there's some feedback and background noise if we are not muted. So I think in general, for commissioners to keep their cameras on, which we've been doing, and generally stay muted, raise your hand to be recognized. I know sometimes we get caught up in the moment and want to respond immediately, and there's other people who maybe haven't had a chance to speak. The program we're using actually does record who speaks how much, and we're not very even. So I just want to try to make sure that all the commissioners are feeling like, we have a process by which everyone's kind of getting enough of their ideas heard. So in that vein, I think, you know, if there is someone who has spoken a few times on an item, you know, I might call on people out of order, you know, even if I see a hand, you know, if there's someone who hasn't spoken, I think that it makes sense for them to have a preference. Then I think sometimes we also make the same points a few times, and I do this as well. You know, if I make a point and I feel really adamant about it, and then maybe the conversation gets away from it, or it looks like the commission's going in a different direction, I think there's this urge to kind of repeat our point to try to get people back on our side, I guess maybe. But it does take up extra meeting time to kind of repeat the same items. And I think those were some of the big things. Another thing that we've kind of, number 10 there, try to keep comments to the policy level. This is something that I think a lot of us do. Really, if there's kind of summarize feedback into kind of the policy. Versus getting into the nitty-gritty of words or exactly how a phrasing is done. And I think that kind of helps us move along. And, you know, if we can really talk about where the direction we want to go and the policy behind where we want to go, and then to use staff and our legal team to really get the exact language where we want it to go. So Paul, if you can scroll down, I think there's a few items at the end that were kind of about structure, and Bernie as our vice chair kind of helping out with some things. Sometimes I found it hard to evaluate kind of the timing and where direction of the discussions are going along the way. So Bernie's going to help as our vice chair with some check-ins on agenda items. If it seems like we've had an awful lot of discussion on something, trying to kind of identify if it seems like we're going to wrap up soon and we'll kind of finish out a topic, let's try to do that. But if it seems like there's a lot of questions and we need some analysis, you know, to kind of identify that before talking, so we can kind of get the data we need and add it to another agenda item, kind of come in fresh when that is needed. And then also sometimes, and this is actually something that actually came up at one of our last meetings, there were some agenda items on the agenda that I had marked as time permitting, because sometimes our discussions don't take that long and we actually move through things pretty quickly. And it seems like there may or may not be time kind of towards the end of the agenda to get to something. So sometimes we do put something on the agenda that says time permitting. There's something actually on our agenda tonight. It's kind of labeled that way. And, you know, I think that one thing Bernie's going to try to help us do kind of along the lines of timing is to kind of evaluate before. I know we got very late at a recent meeting. So maybe not wait till it's very, very late and we're just not going to do it, but maybe try to identify by, say, 8:30 or something, if there's items that we're just feel like we're not going to get to, so that we can make that announcement and there's no one kind of waiting in the audience for that particular item. They would know early enough whether or not we're going to get there. And then also with the chat, sometimes we've had, or Paul or I have had kind of policy questions directed at us during a meeting, which can be kind of pull us away from the main discussion. So I think in general, if people could use the chat, and this would go for the public as well, to use the chat for kind of specific comments or input to the discussion, or obviously a private chat could be for any kind of technical issue. So, I mean, I think that those were some general ideas. I don't know if people had comments on the commissioner items here.
Can I
Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Suggest that we, the commissioners, send you by email suggestions or edits that we would like to see. Then we don't have to spend any time on it now.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. I did feel like this probably needs to get added to another agenda, especially because we're making some suggested edits to the public items, which I think it would be good to have them see before we would adopt something. So I guess, Paul, if you want to kind of scroll down to the public items as well, and then we'll collect some feedback from commissioners and public in the meantime by email. So I think a lot of these things in here are items that we've been operating under with cameras off, mute off, some instructions about how to get our attention when the time comes. And it was brought to my attention that number 7 is actually something that should just get deleted. It's about talking side conversation, so I missed that. And then I don't know, Paul, if you want to scroll down, there's a few things about the chat as well, and timing. So I do agree. I think Michael's suggestion is good. If people want to take a closer look and give comment back, we can at one of our future meetings kind of summarize or make edits and get comments from the public as well. So I guess that was it on this item, unless anyone did have direct feedback they wanted to give right now. Okay, great. Well, thanks for sharing that, Paul, and thank you for, we had gotten a few different suggestions from different people on that. Good. So I guess we can move on to number 5, which is visualization and calculation of the development in the TND, the traditional neighborhood planned unit development. So as Paul said, we do have Mark Kane from SE Group here with us tonight. Paul, did you want to start us out on this?
Just briefly, to introduce Mark, you've met with Mark a few times, but it's been a little while. Mark's been working with Sharon and I in the background on a lot of the work here, and Mark and his team with SE Group are helping us with a lot of the visual presentation of the work, as well as they have a pretty deep experience in working both with municipalities and with the private sector in creating development, and so they plans all across the country, and so it's been very helpful to have them sort of gut check a lot of the work with us. Tonight, as I know commissioners have been really excited, we're going to talk about a couple of different aspects of the form of a traditional neighborhood. So Mark's going to walk you through a presentation that he's put together. We will make that available for the public immediately afterwards, and we'll be happy to post it online. After that, I've got a little calculator that we've put together so that I'll show you how it works to measure density, because I know this has been something commissioners have been really interested in. I wanted to present it to you first, and then I will provide it to you and make it available for the public. It's an Excel sheet where you can actually type in your own scenarios and see how it turns out. So Jessica, if you're comfortable, I will give Mark the reins here and we'll rock and roll.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you again. I'm Mark Kane from SE Group. Paul, could you make me the presenter? And there you go. Thank you. As Paul indicated, I think the purpose of the conversation tonight is kind of twofold. One is to sort of bring forward to the Planning Commission some examples of PUDs, TND PUDs, sort of talking about some of the characteristics of them and also the density issue. And Paul was great enough to sort of gather some neighborhoods in South Burlington, so you can sort of see by comparison the relationship between existing neighborhoods in South Burlington and then PUDs. And then the last part I think we want to sort of walk through, we have been testing the TND regulations as they currently are against a site in South Burlington that Paul provided to us, just to get a sense of what the current draft ordinance might actually do related to establishing a TND form. So it's kind of an ongoing test process. And as Paul indicated, the goal of this will ultimately be to create some visuals that we can use to illustrate the idea around TND and hopefully communicate it in the regulations in a clear way. So as developers look at the regulations, they understand what the city's trying to accomplish. So with that, we'll sort of get started. And Paul, by all means, feel free to jump in here as well. Obviously, some of these you know better than I do. Now, I want to sort of walk through a range of existing neighborhoods in South Burlington, just to give you a sense of what the density is. And then also there's some illustrations on here, Google Earth illustrations, to kind of capture some of the form of that development. So I think it's really important to not separate out the idea of density and form, because they do go together. And I think it's really important, especially as you start looking at the TND regulations, to not separate those two things, because you can have high density in good forms and it feels right, or you can have low density in bad forms and it doesn't feel right. So I'm not judging Simpson Court in my discussion around that. I just want to make sure you have that sort of frame of reference. This is Simpson Court, R4. The net density here is 3.9 units per acre, and it's single family housing type. And again, back to the kind of the purpose of a TND, one of the things you'll see, and this is sort of a traditional subdivision neighborhood, and there's obviously a single family unit type is the predominant form. There's no other diversity of forms there. The relationship between the buildings, they do relate to the surrounding street grid, but there's not a lot of other sort of amenities or open space or civic space or anything that would kind of create a TND. So this is really just a traditional residential development. You can also see in the illustration on the photograph, there's obviously a sidewalk, which is a good thing. Obviously, TNDs would like those as well, but obviously there's not other forms of mobility or connectivity within the plan. Apple Tree, Hadley area, again, R4, 4.3 units per acre. And this is actually, I guess, a couple things going on. So it actually is largely single family lots. It also has a small multifamily unit as well. And this is White Place right here, just for reference. So this is Proctor Avenue. So again, very traditional in its form. You can see on the illustration, it's lacking sidewalks. So that's one of the things, and I guess in a PUD, in a TND PUD, that would really be a requirement. It does have a diversity of, sort of single family types. And obviously one of the things that, we look for in a TND is that sort of variation in the unit mix. But again, it's predominantly single family. It does introduce some elements here which are interesting in terms of long, alleys, which again is something as the TND forms we'll talk about are oftentimes desirable to create that sort of opportunity for circulation without having to necessarily create a lot of curb cuts along the street edge. And
Mark, one thing that I wanted to mention about this neighborhood, and I know that Paul Engels could probably speak much more eloquently to it, but this neighborhood, more than a lot of other ones, has some diversity in the lot sizes too.
Yes.
So, we think of a lot of our neighborhoods as having quarter acre lots. Here, especially as you go over to Meadow Road, a little bit to the east there, you get some larger ones, some smaller ones, and they all work well together, I guess would be my assessment of it. And there's a few duplexes and triplexes sort of hidden in there that one wouldn't necessarily know unless you spend a lot of time walking around in there.
Right, good point. But it is that diversity. The diversity here is expressed largely in lot sizes and obviously less in the form of density. The next one is the Village at Dorset Park. So this is in the southeast quadrant. This is, again, the density is increasing here. So we're getting a little bit more dense as we kind of go. A couple really important aspects of this is there is actually an open space, a civic open space as part of the plan. So it actually is something that is starting to define the character of the development. There obviously is a diversity of forms here. So there's duplexes, there's a fourplex, which is important, sort of kind of creating some variety. Now, in as we'll talk a little bit later in the example we're pulling together, one of the things that you'll sort of notice here is that the diversity is, while there's diversity in the overall neighborhood, it's not integrated diversity. So there's an area for multiplexes and there's an area for single family homes. And one of the things the TND form tries to do is kind of break that model up a bit so that there's not this sort of homogeneity of forms in large blocks. It does introduce a sort of a modified grid, which is again a very defining characteristic of a TND. So it's obviously not consistent. Obviously, it's reflecting some of the realities here. But there's a couple things that I think are appropriate, sort of creating the grid. There's also opportunities for future connections. So this lot is divided up, but there's actually a right of way that allows it. So that's another hallmark of a TND, is that it looks at its surroundings and says, okay, what happens if the neighboring properties want to develop more densely? How does this project relate to those surrounding properties? So again, that's some good sort of pieces and parts that actually sort of make up elements, moving in the direction of a TND. South Village Phase 1, again, also the Southeast Quadrant. Again, the density is now increasing, so 8.9 units per acre, single family, 2 family, 3 family, multi. So it's got a variety of forms. You're seeing a grid sort of happening here. You're starting to see a little bit of open space. Well, one of the things that is lacking is a bit of the sort of the organizing open space, open civic space. It doesn't have that sort of civic environment, so open space environment that really kind of creates the nucleus of the concept. It's sort of missing some of that. Again, it doesn't mean there isn't open space, there is, and I think that's a really important sort of transitional piece. The other piece of it, obviously, and this is one of the things is you'll sort of see in the regulations right now, is this idea of sort of connecting to established grid networks and taking advantage of that. So obviously it is doing that. It's establishing opportunities to connect to the existing circulation systems so that it maximizes those opportunities down the road. And this is a really good example of that. O'Brien Hillside Phase 1, 8 acres, units per acre. Single family, 2 family, has a 3-area parking center. So this is again, back to the things you're seeing in the existing neighborhoods in South Burlington. You are seeing this is a central organizing civic space that the plan revolves around. Now, for reasons that are not necessarily completely evident on the site plan, terrain being probably the most common issue, this doesn't have a strong grid. There's obviously a real challenge to the grid here. That is something that oftentimes becomes a real issue when you have steeper terrain and sort of complicated natural resource constraints and stuff like that. Could that have been sort of fixed somehow? Again, without sort of retconning this plan, possibly there could have been some improvements to kind of increase the lateral circulation through the neighborhoods to kind of improve that connectivity. But it does organize itself around open space and a civic space, which again is really kind of a core hallmark of what the TNDs are trying to do. So this has got some of those elements. The other thing is that it sort of, you can see in the surrounding lands, it's building off of an existing established infrastructure network. So it's taking advantage of existing systems to build from, which is also a really important piece. The unit mix here is probably, if you look at your current regulations or your drafted regulations, is not as diverse as you are seeking in terms of the unit distribution. I think that is something that as the TND sort of get finalized and rolled out, I think that the city has sort of expressed an interest in having a more diverse set of uses and forms. But it certainly is advancing. This is advancing some of those principles that the TNDs espoused, that are espoused in the TND regulations. Rye Meadows, so this is that's again Southeast Quadrant, 6.1 acres, a little bit different. A couple things here that I think are really interesting. It's got a park in the center, so that's again, this is very much kind of a core element. And it's not just a spot in the center. It's actually organizes the development around it. So it's important civic space in the center of this property. It does have a diversity of uses, so single, cottage, and fourplex. So that's a diverse mix that fits kind of where you're hoping for. It has obviously I think this is a stormwater pond, so it actually has some accommodations for some of the infrastructure it's going to need to function as a development in its surroundings. I think one of the things that is sort of useful around this is it has a good grid. Now, maybe another connection here at some point would be a good sort of thing to add, just again as a way of enhancing the connection between this neighborhood and other adjacent neighborhoods. But in general, that's this block length seems to be about right, not too off what you're looking for. The current regulations as they're drafted, I think, has about a 2,000 foot maximum block perimeter. So that would be, if you add up all four sides of a block, they shouldn't be more than 2,000 feet. And so this seems to be probably pretty close. I haven't measured it, but it looks reasonably close to that. And again, if you sort of put yourself in a person traveling down the roadway here, as you go down these streets and along these sidewalks, there is a diversity of unit types along the street. So the experience of actually being on the ground in this environment would be one of sort of seeing not kind of a single unit type. It'd be kind of a diversity of unit types. The other thing I like that they obviously not showing the single family lots, but they are showing some of these other forms is they have presence on the street. So the presumption is that these units would be fronted on the street. So it's not like you're looking at the backside of things. The cottage court is a great example. And I think we have an example in our tester that we sort of used as well, is integrating that into this plan. They also were really smart, and they kept one of the foundational elements of a cottage court is its own sort of green center space that defines the ring or the perimeter of a cottage court. And they did a good job of actually maintaining that. So this is an example of even when you're doing a TND, and so the overall effort is to try to create this unifying organizing structure, you can kind of put other units forms in there and still let them have their own space. So these little smaller cottages, can take advantage of the public civic space here, but also have their own sort of unifying green, which is nice and keeps the integrity of that kind of form intact.
One other feature of this one that I didn't mention in my notes to you, Mark, or in my brief description there, was that the buildings up along Heinsberg Road are also part of this neighborhood. Yep. They're commercial buildings. The uses that have gone in there initially are not necessarily sort of directly serving the neighborhood. They're more things like there's a counselor in there and there's an office in there. But from a structural perspective, they create a really nice buffer between the busy 116 and the neighborhood, while still being a part of the grid. And depending on where the markets are, any of those buildings could turn into a little neighborhood shop at some point. Right. That serves that area.
Right, that's a really good point. I also would like to, highlighting back to the current regulations, you've kind of defined these, it's being defined as these transition zone, this transitional area, the center area, the residential area. So if you look at the way this is sort of laid out, that existing commercial area transitions into the denser residential area. So there's this nice gradation of density within this plan. So
right.
That
similarly, and similarly, Mark, it's hard to see on the plan here, but the location of the stormwater pond and the size of those lots that are up against the Oak Creek Village are a little bit bigger than the rest of them, and that was intentional to match single family to single family, have them be a little bit bigger than the other single family so that they're a little closer related to what's at Oak Creek Village, and to, if they needed to put a stormwater pond somewhere, they did that to sort of create a little bit of a buffer to the adjacent neighborhood where, naturally, nobody likes to see a field next to them becoming part of a development. So they were trying to have it integrated, but also acknowledge the to make an ease of a transition to the adjacent neighborhood.
Right, and I just want a really good point. The other thing I just would add, also, they've left open the opportunity for expansion of this roadway to the adjacent property. Again, as a really good example of developing a TND in context with surroundings, so that there's not going to be a question down the road if this property ever develops where the primary access point is going to be. That's going to be a pretty easy solution right there. Really good points on that.
Mark, before, and I don't know, maybe Mark and Paul, so you have net density and then a units per acre for each of these. And, you know, for the last many years, we've been thinking of densities as, you know, you take the total acreage of the parcel and then you apply a density in units per acre, and then those units can kind of go wherever they go. But you're actually, I just want to be clear, make sure everyone understands. I think you're talking about net density as something different, and I think it might have something to do with the blue areas. So I just want to make sure everyone's really understanding how the density is calculated for those numbers that you have.
Yeah, Paul, would you be able to clarify how you calculated that?
Sure. Yeah, that's the one that thank you for bringing that up, Jessica. The future regulations are really interested in net buildable area as in the PUDs. And so what these illustrations try to do is show what is to try to make it a little bit of apples to apples. And so what net density is it removes anything that is a common area or a resource. In this case, there's a little bit of there's a class 3 wetland that's part of the parkland that's not counted towards the density. The parkland is not counted towards the density. The stormwater pond is not counted, and the roads are not. So what you get is a net density of, and also we removed the areas that are commercial development. So we're really talking about what is the density of the actually residential areas, so that it's apples to apples comparison. So if you look at some of those other ones, like the Sunset neighborhood, and you know, it's basically the entire area. Whoops. Whereas if you fast forward to the Village at Dorset Park, we take out the roadways and the open spaces here at South Village. If the drawing's a little small, can you fast forward by one?
Yep, right here.
The drawing's a little small, but there's a bunch of little small open space parcels in there that sort of right there in the bottom right. And so those are excluded because those are community elements that are for everybody to enjoy. And they've designed it. Actually, you can see that one that's in the bottom right in the screen there. There's a sidewalk that's in front of the homes, and then that's an intentional green in front of that. Since that's a common element, it's not part of the net density. So when we think about in the future, the planned unit developments, when we talk about buildable area, first we take out the hazards and the level 1 resources, then you would take out your infrastructure, and then you would apply the allocations, and the residential allocation is just the residential part. So whatever you have as parks is called civic space. It's its own allocation, just like in here. So that's what this is trying to show here, to bring it a little more apples to apples. And to show that, you know, this is an R4 area, it's 9 units an acre because there's a big open space next to it. That's the farm and the wetlands.
Right. So just to make just a further clarification, I guess, on that. So if you were looking at this by gross density, just like as you were describing, I think, you know, the total land area, you know, the number of units divided by the total land area, not ignoring all those distinctions that Paul was describing, this actual density in a gross basis would be a lot less.
Right. It's about 4 because that's an R4 district.
Right. Right. So let's see. So this is Five Sisters, Howard's, Catherine, Burlington, 10 to 12 units per acre. And again, you see what you really see on this one, I think, is more than anything is, again, this is sort of a traditional urban block, right? Much smaller lot sizes, you know, much more, obviously this is single family, but there's also 2 family, 3 family, 4 family units in here too. So you're starting to get multiplex buildings in this. And what's really amazing about this is if you sort of looked in the site plan, you sort of see some parking in the rear, some garages in the rear. You're getting the response to the increased density of pushing the parking to the back sides where there's opportunity for parking, and some on-street parking, which is an important part of offsetting some of the impact of increasing density, of finding other ways to manage the parking situation. So this is a
The other
great
thing I just wanted to note about this one was that while there are single family, 2 family, 3 family, 4 family, virtually every building has the feel of a single family. And that's one of the characteristics under the draft that you'd be looking at, is that though you can put a 3-plex or a 4-plex, it has to have the appearance of a large single family. So the one on the bottom right is a duplex. The upper unit has a door on the side.
Yeah.
For example.
So allows you to basically get, double, triple the density on the same size lot and have it feel like it's not, visually incongruous. So a couple bigger sort of highlight, and obviously that was a little tour to South Burlington. Obviously the other thing is to sort of look at some other approaches to TNDs, and this is by no means an exhaustive analysis of the situation. This is some illustrations out of Ithaca, New York. The different parts of this TND go from 8 to 12 units per acre. So you're getting into the density range that South Burlington's sort of looking for. Couple of really interesting things. Again, that idea of like multiplexes looking like, not, they're bigger obviously, but they're not, they have appearances and orientations to the street to make them look more residential in character, or more approachable in character. Obviously sidewalks, sidewalks and other sort of accommodations for mobility. A lot of the parking is in the rear piece of this. There's obviously increasing density. There's a green, a really important focal point for the development that actually kind of drives the design. And then there's this, in this case, there's obviously a gas station and a mini mart sort of thing. And the idea behind this would be that, obviously that's all happening in the backside of it. So from a street view perspective, the form and the orientation, the placement is very consistent with sort of the surrounding pattern, but you can still accommodate that kind of use. So this is really kind of a classic example of a TND in sort of a more dense environment. Commercial areas, I mean, obviously in the sort of denser commercial areas, you have mixed use farms where you can end up getting between 12 and 20 units per acre. So I should really say mixed use areas. This is in Colorado. So this is in kind of near Denver, not too far from Denver. And this is sort of an existing developed area. This sort of yellow area is kind of the new part of it. These are lots, so don't get, it's not clear in this rendering what's what, but there is actually diversity of forms within this. And this illustration here kind of shows a green, oops, sorry about that. Shows a green, shows some larger large multiplex buildings. These are kind of more apartment style condo buildings. These actually are these buildings right here. So this view is actually down this boulevard towards this park. And you see in this illustration, kind of the surrounding land uses and bigger, denser development, but all with sort of a consistency of character that's trying to sort of establish a more of a neighborhood feel to it. Circulation obviously is paramount through this. It uses a lot of alleys as an example to allow for connectivity to some of these smaller units. And these alleys also function as part of a circulation network in this TND. So you can use these alleys to get all the way out to this open space that's adjacent to it. This is off the property. So really interesting example of a sort of large scale TND. So we wanted to do a little test of a sample parcel in South Burlington, just to kind of understand, you know, now that the regulations have cooked for a while and there's some metrics that we can use to test against. We wanted to use the sort of the current regulations to sort of walk through a scenario. So Paul was kind enough to point us into the direction of a property here off Spear Street. We have not talked to the landowner, so there's no coordination with anybody other than ourselves and the current draft regulations. But the information that we're using was provided by the city in terms of this habitat corridor, this habitat block that's there, a wetland area and buffer associated with it. And those are important considerations as you'll see in the kind of the process. It's R2 zoning. It's the scale that actually is most likely is kind of the right size to actually kind of foster a TND, because it's got enough land area, but it's got a couple constraints, obviously, besides the environmental constraints. The issues that I just mentioned is it also has a jog in it that sort of creates some, you know, potential challenges. It's got access off Spear Street, which has to be sort of accommodated, and it also has existing development around it that needs to be responded to. There is the multi-use path on the along Swift Street too, which is something that we'll talk a little bit about what might be possible with that. So back to that calculation method that Paul was kind of describing. So the land area is about 2.3 acres roughly, as Paul kind of alluded to. The first thing is to sort of take out those resource constraints like the wetland and the habitat corridor, and do a calculation of what is the net buildable acre. So the 16.26 goes down to 9.16 acres when you factor in all of those resource constraints, and then you take out the roads and rights of way, as we'll see in the site plan in a minute. There also could be other considerations for reductive calculation of that. So about 7.1 acres of constraints that are need to be addressed. Then you get into the allocation piece. So in this example, we're obviously residential in form. We could have decided to do some commercial, but as you can sort of see from the location, it's not a great candidate for sort of non-residential uses. That being said, that could have been accommodated. But we also wanted to work, in terms of this case study, this test case, wanted to just sort of keep it as simple as possible for the purposes of illustration. So the maximum percentage of residential by land allocation in the current regulation is 85%. So we allocated in the plan about 83%. So we're not over the max, and we're well going towards it. The minimum allocation for civic open space is 10%. So we're at 17%. So we're slightly over allocated as it relates to the question.
Bernie?
Yeah, just a very quick question. So you say current regulations. Are you talking about the regulations that we currently have in place, or
Current
the
draft.
regulations that we're currently proposing?
Current draft regulations.
Okay, so this is that.
This is
that
utilizing
helps
the
quite a
current
bit.
version of.
Make sure people understood that this wasn't what exists now. This is what we're proposing.
Right. This is the current draft as it exists today, or last
Okay,
week.
thank you.
So obviously calculating the just gonna get my go to meeting out of the way here. The calculation, so that again, in terms of the land allocation process, this we conform to the allocation as the draft regulations are suggested. Then becomes this sort of process of kind of going back and reconciling that relative to the types of units, housing types we want to have, figuring out what the allowable unit mix is based upon these allocations that we talked about, and working towards that targeted density. So we are kind of kept it as a sort of as a simple test case, kept it at about 8 units per acre as a kind of a density we're trying to shoot for. as it looks to the allocations in that of that 7.61 acres, we've ended up allocating about 4.15 acres to the single family units, 1.32 acres to multiplex, 0.61 to cottage court, and 1.5 to duplex. And again, working with those target ratios of allowable units, we end up getting a sort of unit mix here of 30 single family, 10 multiplex, 5 cottage court, and 12 duplex. So this is the percentage breakdown of this unit mix. Actually, I missed the total column. What is that? 40, 57, I guess. This is the breakdown of those unit mixes. So what's important to recognize out of this is, again, there's a diversity. We didn't sort of pick one unit type and sort of go with it. We sort of broke that up. This has got 4 different distinctive housing types included in it. And as you'll see in the site plan, they've been allocated in ways that are sort of not homogeneous.
And just a reminder, and I see there's a couple questions here, but just as a reminder that Mark, in putting this together, they pretty much hit the targets of there had to be at least 3 types. Each type had to represent at least 15%. And I think that the maximum is 50. I think Mark's at 53, but we'll give him a pass because this is his first time doing it. So imagine that one of those
rounding errors.
But this is essentially meeting that mix requirement.
So
Mark, do you want to take some questions now, or do you want to keep going?
It might be better if we take them now so that they don't lose track of their question.
Okay. Monica?
Michael and Monica.
Michael?
Michael was kind of first.
Oh, Michael was first. Okay. Michael?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, we also had unallocated space, open space, and non-residential space within that 83%, but I don't see that we've done any of that here. Is this just because it's a hypothetical, or?
You don't have to. You can allocate all your space. The regulations, the draft regulation seems to allow you to allocate the land area. So the idea of actually having unallocated space, I think, is something that a developer could do if they're not quite sure as to what it needs to be.
Right, so the unallocated could be reserved. It could be additional on any of the ones above the minimums. In this case, Mark did more open space than the minimum. It sometimes could be things like infrastructure that don't easily fall into another category. So it's possible it could be that. There is, I think, also a 5% non-residential in the TND, but which, a portion of that open space could become that in this case.
Yeah, and we'll see that there's a
community building or something like that.
Yeah, and actually there is a green. So as Paul said, the open space is big enough, so you could put a small amenity building on the open space and have it satisfy that requirement.
Okay, Monica, you had a question too before we?
Yeah, so when we say this is our current draft, does that mean this is the buildable type, Paul, like the building type?
Yes.
Yes, so this is the current draft that you have.
Or building type. Okay, so then can you explain the target density? Why would you even have a target density if it's building type and you can not?
I think in this case, Mark, imagine that you're a developer who's considering what you want to be putting together. So that's sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but I think it's sort of like, that's their vision somewhat coming through.
Right. Yeah, the idea, obviously you allow a range of densities, right? And you can go, within a range. I wanted to keep it sort of simple for this test case, just to sort of say our target for our densities here is going to be 8. And obviously, as Paul mentioned, this would have to be cooked more as you kind of get to final submission in terms of the regulations. But that was our objective, was to try to get to 8 units per acre for those different housing types, building types.
So I'm sorry, just to be clear then, somebody else under building type could have said, well, I think I want my building type, my target density to be 12, and that the building type would allow for that.
Some will. Yeah, and again, the mix would change slightly because you'd have to get, you might have to have more land area allocated to single family to get that density for single family, or more land area allocated for multifamily, multiplex to get that density. So
Right.
it's a game of sort of balancing of those different areas.
Right. So the more you go towards the extremes of what's possible, Monica, the more you'll find that other constraints start to bump up against it. This sort of 8 is kind of right in the middle. If you went to the very lowest end of density, you would wind up having to, stretch the lot sizes as much as possible for the single family homes. And you probably would not have multiplexes in there. You might have 2 different types of duplexes. If you're going the other end, you might be looking to do more multiplexes and things like that, but the multiplexes can only be in certain locations. They can only be at the corners of parcels, corners of blocks. So, it becomes a little bit of a give and take because you only have so many corners to work with. And the more you can create smaller blocks, but if you have smaller blocks, then you wind up having more roadway. And so, it becomes difficult to get up to the upper ends unless you've got a perfect parcel that has no oddities to it.
Okay,
And that's
Bernie?
not like,
Yeah, so maybe just a clarifying question, Paul. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the way our regulations are kind of written is, we allow for different building types, but I think, don't we also require a certain percentage of each building type?
That's correct. So you
So-
would have a maximum of 50% of your neighborhood can be any one building type.
Right.
You would
So
need to
that
have at
also
least,
governs, it kind of leads back into kind of the allowable units and Monica's question then
Right.
too, and that we kind of provide some guidance on the mix that we want. And so they can mix it however they want within our guidance, and that will change the density, but we allow different building types. and
right,
stuff like
that's
that.
exactly it. And then Bernie, what I'm going to be talking about at the end of the meeting tonight is there are some levers, some radio dials that you all can turn if you so choose to sort of increase or decrease some of these maximums and minimums.
Right. The other piece
and
of that,
that would affect what is allowed to be built.
the other piece of that, I think, Bernie, just for your, sort of clarity, is that in addition to that, the allocation, the percentages, other things built into the regulations also will sort of shape what's possible, like the need for parking, for example. To be able to put a lot of multiplexes together and provide adequate parking for all that will limit, could encourage, depending on the circumstance, how much density they can get. So if the lot shape is weird, or if there's resource constraints that really limit density because of parking lots, that obviously will change the form there. In all likelihood, the developer would have to respond to that situation.
So in my role as timekeeper, this is supposed to go till 8:15, and Paul, you had mentioned that you were going to talk about radio dials and stuff. So just kind of a question on, maybe looking at trying to wrap the examples up so that we can
I'm almost
have
actually
time for your radio.
a few more slides actually. So back to the sort of that mix that we sort of came in here. This is kind of a graphic representation of that allocations. So single family residential, duplex, multiplex, small, and then cottage court. So back to this sort of basic components here. Center organizing green, obviously responding to the constraints. This diversity of uses, the grid network actually conforms to the requirements that are the perimeter requirements, the block minimum length requirements. And then there's these opportunities for expansion of the road network to kind of serve surrounding land uses. Then when you sort of overlay on top of that some of the development patterns, you get this sort of pattern that's emerging. So cottage court here, duplexes, single family duplexes, single families. One of the things that's really important is obviously the parking is off of on the back side of this, and in order to screen it from Spear Street, the idea was to put the parking, carports on the back side of this that would kind of provide some parking for these duplexes, but also kind of screen that from the roadway. The garages, you sort of see garages here. There's a combination of attached and detached. They don't kind of have this sort of consistency of garage, 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 kind of broken up. Sidewalks throughout. Obviously, one of the things that we're showing, this is a good example of, again, in order to get that density for this is the higher density neighboring development in that transition zone, to get some of these multiplexes to sort of work here. The idea is that there might have to be a lot that's dedicated to some parking, and that would be able to be shared by several adjacent structures. So rather than trying to create, a building with a lot, so using shared driveways to provide access to parking in the rear of these multiplexes. Couple other things I think would be sort of good, sort of back to the center idea. So this obviously we sort of seen as transitional, really important sort of transition in density between the adjacent higher density multifamily development and this area. And then this is obviously the center. So the idea of the center is actually going to establish the orientation of this project. Other thing I would mention is this has got an alley here. And as the idea is that instead of using this road network and sort of breaking it up with all these curb cuts to provide parking, we're sort of showing an alley that could provide parking for the single family or the duplexes in this area without having to sort of break up the roadway. So kind of breaking it down a little bit, again, just sort of highlighting some of the key points. Obviously the grid, one of the things that this plan does is, by illustration, is it sort of uses a neighborhood grid street for a couple of the routes, but also uses a narrow street for some of the other routes. And I'll talk a little bit about the importance of that, giving us options for keeping the character more residential scale, and then allowing for some of the roadways to actually provide some on-street parking, which could offset some of the needs for residences and or for the green. Parking in the rear, I sort of mentioned also that civic space obviously is adjacent to, and it could be, it's where amenities like playgrounds or a building could be, that kind of thing. Obviously, we obviously saw that example, the existing example in South Point, but a cottage court could be integrated into this plan so that it's sort of has its own little center organizing green space, but it's kind of functioning as part of this larger plan. Back to the sort of the combination, so the mix of uses. So the mix of uses in this area actually are along the street, so it's very, very diverse in its piece of presentation. And then the road network is designed. So obviously this adjacent lot, I think, is under the same ownership. So eventually, if this wanted to connect through, that's possible. And the shared use path is actually south of here, so it's possible that a sidewalk or shared use path could be extended ultimately to Swift Street and then connect to the shared use path. And we talked a little bit about this, sort of, again, the organizing principle. Obviously, the buffers are piece. The wider streets would provide on-street parking, so that could be a situation where we don't have to worry about creating, as much sort of guest parking for some of the higher density stuff, because there could be some on-street parking associated with this. Right now, this is rendered just to show the street edge. I think this is 22 feet, the normal sort of narrow, or 20 feet, and this is the 24. But there'd be green space and trees and all that other sort of characteristic stuff that would go along with this. So the last thing I just want to sort of highlight is again, what is the one thing that we're going to be looking at as the regulations are kind of tweaked and finalized, is how do we actually communicate to the development, through the development regulations, some of these characteristics, these requirements that you're putting out there. And I think these block diagrams are helpful in illustrating some of the things that we've been looking at. And as Paul mentioned, in the examples that we gave, this idea of sort of defining characteristics in terms of height and setback and orientation of the building, and the characteristics of the building, so that they have a visual consistency on the street edge, so that it doesn't feel like it's sort of, even if it's a multi-family building, for example, or a single family building, it feels consistent. Similarly, the cottage courts, for example, have some ratios and perspectives that need to be done. Well, obviously, parking in the rear, making sure we're trying to encourage that, making sure the green space is kind of front and center. Townhouses, obviously, the use of carports to kind of screen or in this case, providing an alley that would service those carports rather than sort of cutting through the primary street and kind of accessing that. So these are all sort of the tools in the toolkit that we think that some illustrative visuals would help communicate so that when somebody's sort of interpreting the code, they'll be able to sort of be guided a little more clearly about the intention. So I think that's all I had tonight. Yeah. And else, Paul, if you have anything else.
Well, I think that that's really helpful. Any questions or comments for Mark? I think Paul was gonna maybe next expand on that with kind of how we can play with some of those numbers to maybe get the type of range of development that Mark was talking about in the first part of his presentation. Monica?
Sorry, and just at some point, can you also explain what before PUDs, what density could have been there? Like how is the building type differing on the 16 total acres with the 9 acres of buildable on an R2? What are we looking at from pre-interim zoning to the PUD? Now or later?
Yeah, so I can answer that fairly quickly, Monica. Mathematically, an R2 district today is one of those districts that you hate the way it's described, which is that it's an R2, but if it's a planned unit development, it's 4 units an acre. So theoretically, the current regulations would allow for 4 times 16 is 64. But you know, not with necessarily a lot of guidance as to how that is arranged. So that you know, mathematically, that's how that would come out. But the current regulations, as we've talked about before, don't sort of pay any attention to what might affect the math down to the practical. So, you know, there is a wetland on the property. Maybe it's not so big, and so potentially they could fit most of that in there. But if those wetlands had been half that land, half of the entire 16 acres, then I could say mathematically 64 units. But as a practical matter, that's you know, not what we're seeing in South Burlington being built. And so this is the reason at the very beginning of this discussion that we were shifting over to talking about net density. Is the net density is the density in the area that is actually being built upon.
And I think, Monica, just to kind of reinforce that point that Paul just made, is that if this was to have developed as a traditional PUD under the current or the old regulations, the current regulations, the other thing that would have been factored in there is, you know, the setback requirements and all those other things. And so when you start adding all those current regulation requirements into it, you know, I think that the plan we're showing is probably, in terms of the yield, the number of units, is not very far off from what you would have been able to get to under traditional zoning, but the characteristics of it are decidedly much different. And that's kind of the main point with the TND is, you know, maybe you get some more density. And again, we could have pushed the envelope on the unit mix there to go up if we wanted to. I mean, there was certainly room to do that. So that we could have probably gotten another 20 or 30 units if we really wanted to put more multiplexes and sort of really elevate that mix of it.
I think, you know, just one thing to add to it, which is to say that the current regulations, planned unit development, because there's so much flexibility, could, in theory, result in something similar to what Mark has shown.
Yeah.
South Village was essentially built under the existing regulations, but it takes a developer with a uniquely forward-thinking vision to decide to do that without any guidance from the city. Right. So, you know, whereas they could have put those organizing greens in the middle, that's not what we've historically seen done, except in a handful of rare circumstances where it was vision driven.
And just to test that out, what I actually is I handed this project, this development, this site plan to somebody who's not read the regulations at all and has never seen them before until she actually started it. So I said, look at these regulations as they're drafted and work your best to kind of get to that point. So I think that was a blind test. I've been involved in it. Obviously, I didn't want to sort of participate in that, but I think it was really helpful because where she got to was this sort of recognition that you needed this mix of units. You got to sort of get these allocations out. You know, the grid is the organizing principle. So she kind of followed what the draft regulations are, and it led her to this point. Now, any developer could have done the same thing, obviously, with the regulations as they're adopted, and pushed a little bit further in terms of density because there was allowance for that. There is more. You could have done more, but I think it proves that was one of the reasons we wanted to go through that exercise that way, so that we can sort of test if we can read the regulations and have it make sense to what you're trying to accomplish. And it seems like it would direct development in the direction you want to go.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Mark. Paul, did you want to get into the calculator piece?
Yeah, so let me show this to you. This is a little calculator that I've got, and there's one half of it you have in your packet, and the other half I'll send over shortly. Let me just pull it up here.
So Paul, you're just going to demonstrate this and then send it to people and let them play with it so that they can
That's
maybe
it
ask
exactly.
more detailed questions on density next time.
Yep, that's exactly it. Let me just.
Yeah, good clarification, Bernie, because so I think we want to get through this piece before we move on.
It's a familiarization so that people can play with it on their own and ask more educated questions next time.
All right, so this is a little calculator. It does not result in the pretty pictures that Mark had, but it does give an output of numbers. And so there's a couple categories in here, and I'll just walk you through it. So the first box here is, what's your parcel of land? The things that you can play with are the things in the orange boxes. So you can decide that you've got a 10-acre parcel, a 20-acre parcel, 8-acre parcel, whatever you might choose. You would then choose how much hazards are on your property. So in the example that Mark had, I think he had 16, and remind me, Mark, I think you had 3.5 acres of wetlands and wetland buffers, and about 3.6 acres of habitat connectors. So, you know, that's about where Mark's was. We did an estimate for right-of-way streets and things. In a real one, that might be adjusted, but we just sort of left it at 10%. So what you get here is a net buildable acre area of 8 acres, 350,000 square feet. So the next thing that you would choose to do, and this is your second box, is what do you want to do as your allocation? So I'm just going to go with what Mark did. I think he did 83 here. He decided that he made the civic space 17. I'm going to go with civic space 12 and mixed use 5. And then I'm going to make no unallocated. So roughly the same thing he had. That translates into the number of acres and the number of square feet. The next box that you see here, these are the minimums and maximums. I inadvertently left out the cottage court. We can add that in for the upcoming one, but these are the lot sizes that are associated in the draft building types with each type of building. So if you choose to do a detached single family home, you can put it on as small as 5,000 square feet or as big as 10,000 square feet, which is about a quarter acre. And then, you know, a single family home is obviously one dwelling unit on a lot. This should read 4, so I'll correct that before we wrap up. But a duplex, a stacked duplex, an over/under has 2 dwelling units on the on a single lot. So then you get to your calculator. And your calculator here is set to the draft that is in the regulations. And you would then choose that you would then play with these numbers, putting yourself in the shoes of the developer. And you've got to make sure that all your green boxes say met. So you've got a total land area that is residential. You can't be more than 289,000 square feet. And then you've got these mix of homes. You have to be at least, you can't be more than 50% of all of your homes in any one type. And you have to have at least 3 types that are 15%. That last one is going to go on the honor system because my math is not good enough to make this calculated. So here we've got an example that is not quite meeting it. So let's say I'm going to make my average 7,500 square feet for my single family homes. Right now I'm way over in my total area, so I might have to make this 25 single family homes. And I might have to make this 10 duplexes, and looks like I've got a little bit more room, so I might do that. So here's a scenario that works. On my 8 acres of developable land, I decided to have 7,500 square foot single family lots. I put 25 of those. I put 12 duplexes that are attached, 4 duplexes that are stacked, and 18 units that are in small multiplexes, so 6 of those. Obviously, you'd have to figure out how to lay these out on the land, so it may not all be possible, but we're just doing a math exercise here. What you get here is 59 total dwelling units, a net density of 7.4 units per acre, and the gross density in this example, and this goes back to Jessica's question from the beginning, is 3.6, because you had the wetland, you had the habitat connector, you had the roads, and then you had your land that was allocated to parks and non-residential. And that's the calculator. So basically you can play with anything in there and just see what you can get as lowest and highest. When I ran through it, the absolute smallest I could come up with, lowest density, was 4.4 units per net acre. The highest that I was able to come up with mathematically was 15.5, but I don't know that that would be possible based on where you have to locate these things. But I know that commissioners asked me to sort of say, what's the theoretical maximum? And then lastly, this is in your packet, and this is just sort of food for thought. These are the big levers to play with. These are the things that would affect the shape of the neighborhood and affect the density. And so, you've got here a civic space minimum of 10%. You could choose to make that 15%. That was in Sharon's draft. That would mean that 5% more of the developable land can't be housing, would have to be open space, and therefore it has all the downstream effects of everything else. You could adjust the lot sizes for the various different unit types. Sharon and Mark did ask me to note that, they can be adjusted, but probably in relatively small ways, because if they start to become double or half what they were, it really changes the character to not really be a neighborhood. But if you were to say, 2,500 square feet for each half of the duplex is a little small, let's try 3,000, then that's probably workable. And then the last thing that could be adjusted in the lever dials, big things, are the housing unit mix requirements. Right now we have it set to, you have to have 3 types if you've got a 10-acre parcel. You have to have it no more than 50% of any one type and no less than 15% for it to count as a type. You could theoretically set a maximum on certain ones. You could say that townhomes, realistically, they probably can't be more than 20 or 30% regardless, but you could put a hard cap on it just for comfort. Or you could say that certain types have to be a minimum. You could say that singles, twos, and cottages need to make up at least 30% of the neighborhood. Keeping in mind the that the housing report from that was part of this back in 2015 did identify, where the future needs are in the city, that there's certainly a need for things that are other than singles and twos. And so, we caution going too far in any one direction, but these are some of the levers that you can play with to get the right scale of neighborhood. And that's what I wanted to show you.
I think Michael had a question.
Oh, Michael? Or was it just your bad hand up?
No, he was waving like he had a question.
I had a question, but I answered it myself, which was whether an attached duplex is a side by side and therefore would have a larger footprint. But I understand that it can be 2,500.
Right. So they'd be side by side, and each half is on its own lot, so that the lot is divided through the middle in a side by side duplex.
Okay.
I got it.
So Paul, the idea is that you're going to email the Excel sheet, and then we'll have a more detailed discussion at one of our future meetings.
I'll also post it online for everyone who's interested from the public who'd like to play with it themselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess before we wrap up this item, does anyone else have any specific questions about what they saw, or need any more information to be able to do? Duncan?
Yeah, Paul and maybe Mark, just a quick question. And again, I've had drums wrapping my small brain around this a couple times. So the hypothetical, project that you just showed us, what was the max density that would be allowed on that parcel? I'm sorry, I can't remember if you referenced that or not. I'm just wondering what the.
We have not tested the max. We can actually push it up to see what the max was. We kind of were shooting for kind of what we thought was a sort of as an example, a reasonable sort of moderate level of intensity there. It would be higher. We have not tested it.
But as we're writing it with building type, it's really up to the developer to look at it and use building type to determine what the density is going to be?
Right. So what happens, Duncan, is, as the numbers go up, the challenges, as the density goes up, the challenges for how to achieve that start to mount. So Mark described, for example, hey, we've got some 3 and 4 plexes. We got to figure out a place to park, to create parking for those. And so, while they get a little more density, that density is then lost. I don't want to describe it as a whack-a-mole game, but it's a little bit of playing with these things. If you choose to go with duplexes, you saw that Mark had moved to having a little alley in the back in order to provide parking, because the design of them has to be sort of up against the street, so you wind up losing a little bit of space in the back for your alley. And so, while you can go up in some things, that's going to force some other things down. So it gets, that's why we've been a little bit, it's been difficult for us to say, here's the density number, because how much investment is somebody willing to make? Are they willing to take advantage of a little bit of slope and put underground parking under their townhomes? And if they've got the, just a little bit of slope, they may be able to achieve that. But that might not be achievable on the neighboring property. Does that make sense? So the design really winds up dictating the density more than the number.
Okay.
We'll take Michael and then Ariel after that.
Maybe one of the answers to Duncan's questions is what market is the developer aiming for, which would then dictate what type of housing he's going to put on that, and that would in the end also dictate the density. If he wants to build big expensive houses, well, the density is going to be lower. If a large proportion of them. It's a question of the mix of the types of housing that the developer chooses to build would end up dictating the density.
Just to follow up with Michael, your point, I think is Paul was sort of showing those levers. I think that's a really a big area where the Planning Commission could kind of, you know, create some structure that actually promotes that. Because I mean, obviously, if you were to say, for example, that you, in combination of duplexes, triplexes, or multiplexes, you need those need to add up to some certain percentage of the overall residential density, you know, housing types, then that could, in turn, that could actually increase the density that they have to achieve.
Yeah.
So
Right.
you can get it a number of different ways.
And I think the piece of that sometimes we miss is that it's not changing the land area that we're using up, because the land area is set separately.
Yeah, and that you know, going back sort of as Paul alluded to, sort of we took a little bit of a hiatus in terms of the nuts and bolts of what you guys were working on, and in that interim period of time, you guys have really fine-tuned that hazard area, the constraints component to this, to really clarify where those areas are. So what's happening now is really all within the envelope that is possible. And so the density, just to put this back to that net density question, it's just talking about increasing or decreasing the net density. The conservation land is preserved, the open space is preserved, all those things are there.
So Ariel, did you have a question or comment?
Hi, so my question has to do with kind of forward thinking. So in other words, if the community is focused with the roofs facing the south, this would give individual homeowners an ability to have solar panels that would be more effective in reducing their energy costs. Also, there is a thought that there are solar companies in South Burlington that specialize in having solar panels that are over carports and garages that would be used to basically recharge electric vehicles. And so I just wanted to, I know this might be more detailed than you're at the point right now, but just kind of wanted to put that in the mix.
Just as a aside, I don't know if you caught it in the example we used, that's the concept we used. The actual site plan is oriented north-south. So all of those buildings, you know, with design would be able to have solar ready roofs for sure, which is awesome.
You had a comment in the chat. You have to unmute yourself though, Jess.
Oh goodness. So comment in the chat, Vince Poldak, this presentation was very helpful. Paul's calculator is an excellent idea and very clever, and I completely agree. Anything else from the public or from commissioners before we wrap up for tonight? We will be returning to this after we play with the calculator. Monica?
It's just making sure that as we go forward, we're clearly articulating how this buildable type is a benefit to developers who are concerned about the hazards and the additional habitat blocks that we're saying you cannot build on, that this building type is in fact kind of equaling out that density concern. That yes, we're conserving more land, but with this buildable type and this calculator will show you that you still have the opportunity to achieve, you know, the density that the old plan offered or not. And I think that's just what we need to make clear. And I don't know how to answer that with the calculator because it only addresses building type. You know what I'm saying? So just going forward, that's the question people are asking us is, are the hazards taking away and habitat blocks taking away from what I can do right now?
Yeah, so Monica, to answer that question, I'm working separately with Melanie from the Regional Planning Commission to give a zoning district level rough build out calculation of what the current rules could practically do, what the future rules could do. It's rough, and we really can't go more fine-grained than the zoning district level, but that's the objective, to help answer that question. When I show it to you, I think one thing that'll be really important is there's, as I mentioned before, there's the mathematical of what could theoretically happen, and there's what has actually been built over the last 40 years in South Burlington, and it's not necessarily the same thing.
Okay, then I think we are going to move on to the next item, the continued land development regulation work session, starting with kind of the affordable housing component and how that is going to fit in with our new language.
You did have a brief chat from Sandy Dooley.
Okay, and since that's with the last conversation, this has been very helpful. Thank you. And the big difference is that these rules promote developments that will function as neighborhoods. That is the goal, or a goal. Great.
All right. So the next conversation here, as I said in my notes, I sort of want to reset the discussion from that had started last week at the last meeting about the subject of affordable housing and inclusionary zoning. And the I guess where I wanted to start was, as you know, currently we've got two structures of regulations that relate to affordable housing right now. Within the transit overlay district, there's an inclusionary requirement, meaning that a certain proportion of the development must be affordable, and there's offsets to accommodate that. And then there's a bonus structure on top of that. Elsewhere in the city, so outside of the transit overlay district and in the southeast quadrant, there's not an inclusionary requirement, but there is an affordable housing density bonus that if you choose to provide affordable housing, you get a bonus. Both establish the same ultimate maximum development density. It's 1.5 times whatever is in the underlying zoning district. So the math is very different as to how one gets to it, but fundamentally the cap is the same cap in both cases. What Jessica and I had been striving to bring to you at your last meeting was, with the replacement of the current regulations and the current PUDs with what you've just talked about and seen with Mark, if you choose to keep the inclusionary standards and/or the affordable housing bonuses, they will need to be modified to match this structure. So whether it's outside of the, whether it's inside the transit overlay district where the inclusionary zoning currently applies, or it's outside, one way or another, we have to sort of, translate assuming that you're planning to keep the inclusionary requirement, to translate that into the future PUDs. The second question for you to consider, which we'd sort of jumped to in the last meeting, and I apologize for that, is if you choose to, you can then apply the whatever you've chosen to do with the inclusionary that might apply to a parcel, a TND along Williston Road. You could then choose to apply that same thing citywide or not, because it will already have been built for a traditional neighborhood within the transit overlay district. Does that make sense conceptually?
Yes, and Monica had brought this up like many, many months ago, the fact that the current affordable housing rules wouldn't just automatically work with the PUD that we're writing. So, there has to be some kind of modification to make it work right.
Right. Now, the good news is, so there's the simple part of it and the slightly more complex part of it. The good news, the simpler part of it is that if for wherever you have inclusionary zoning, the state law says that you must provide incentives to the developer in order to offset their costs, essentially. Part of that can be met just by having adopted the new PUDs. Similar to in city center, when you put in the inclusionary zoning, you had eliminated maximum density. So to a certain extent, some of that test of incentives is met just by allowing more flexibility, not having to necessarily do an additional bonus for doing inclusionary. That probably gets you part of the way. The second part of it is what specific incentives do you want to give? Some of them may be things that you already have that says that if you build a larger inclusionary unit, it counts for 2. So that's an incentive. Sharon and I have had some good conversations about how could one address inclusionary in a traditional neighborhood without sort of necessarily going up in more density. If it's already designed to be a compact neighborhood, then you don't necessarily want to then sort of add something on top of it. So one suggestion that she wanted you all to think about was a lever that you could turn would be to provide an allowance for a higher minimum, that as a developer, if you have a inclusionary requirement, your minimum, instead of being 4 units an acre, maybe your minimum becomes 5 units an acre. And so you have a leg to stand on in front of the DRB and in court to say, that's my floor. So instead of thinking of the bonus being on top, it could be raising the floor so that they know that they get a guarantee of a certain amount. So that's some of the stuff I just wanted to present and then get your initial thoughts on overall about what you want to be doing about all this.
Lost my unmute. Ted, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. One of my concerns is in addressing what we just talked about was, I would think it would be an incentive for a developer to build duplex, triplex, and quads, as opposed to single family homes from a cost perspective. So my fear is, and on top of it, with regard to the inclusionary zoning, let's say in the southeast quadrant, my fear is that you won't find very many single family homes, cottage homes, we're talking about, large houses. And that is my concern. Are we looking for young professionals or are we looking for families, young families? My personal feeling is that we should try to make areas more conducive to young families, which also go into the schools, which also I think are more active in the community. That's a personal thing. So I really fear that we have to be careful about the inclusionary zoning and also the whole issue with regard to the PUDs, that we don't suddenly have far too many single family homes. And again, I'm emphasizing, I do like the cottage style homes. They don't have to be big, but they can be on small acres. So that's my comment.
So Ted, what I would say to that is, I think, that's a really helpful comment, and the incentives and also the radio dials that I was just talking about can be situated to foster and encourage that which the city wants to do. So if you wanted to support more, say 2 or 3 bedroom, say 3-bedroom homes for young families, then that's the kind of thing that in the inclusionary could be incentivized, strongly incentivized if you chose. And so then a developer says, hey, if I build some of these, then I get something else. You can also, as I was describing the radio dials, for a traditional neighborhood, you can set your minimums and maximums to suit what is appropriate for South Burlington. So that, that's why we wanted to start with the radio dial discussion tonight, to sort of get your brains kind of chewing on this subject of what do you want to foster in the community.
Well, that's what I'd like to foster, is more single family homes.
Okay, and Bernie, did you have your hand up? And then Michael?
I'm all set. Paul, I was just going to comment on Ted's stuff, and Paul answered it. So
Very good. Michael?
Yeah, I was just wondering whether we could take the example that Mark Kane used and apply all the density bonuses and incentives that we think will apply in a TND, and then see how that would work out, how they would come out.
Yeah, I guess that's actually a really good point. And Paul, one of the things you were saying was it wouldn't necessarily have to be extra units. And I guess that's something that is a little hard to picture. You know, if we had, say, a limit of the percentage that would be multifamily, would we maybe give an allowance for more of the percentage to be allowed to be multifamily, or what kinds of things were you?
Sure. So let me give a couple of examples. There's an application in front of the city right now using our current standards, the O'Brien Eastview neighborhood. They have proposed as part of their development, they have to meet the current inclusionary requirement. And they have decided that they are proposing their affordable units to be 3-bedroom units. In doing so, each affordable unit that they create counts as 2 of their minimum. So rather than, I can't remember the total number, but I'm going to make something up. Instead of 20 affordable dwelling units of any size, they're choosing to build 10 larger ones to meet family needs. So that doesn't change the unit mix at all. It just means that instead of being an apartment, they're making it part of a townhome. And so it's, and our regulations essentially incentivize that, and they, presumably ran the math and also thought about the character of neighborhood that they wanted. And they thought, instead of building a little 1-bedroom unit, or 20 1-bedroom units, why don't we build 10 3-bedrooms to meet a family need? And financially, it's making sense to them. So that's one way that it could be done.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of nods on that one. It seems like we want to keep that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And your second example?
A second example would be that those radio dials that I just described could be adjusted a little bit if you do for the inclusionary. So you could say you get a little bit more. You could say that instead of a 50% maximum on a certain type, maybe it becomes 55% or something like that. And then the third one, which I mentioned a minute ago that Sharon wanted to suggest, is rather than thinking of it as being more development, think about raising the floor. So that currently the draft that you have says there has to be a minimum of 4 dwelling units per acre, which is realistically about the smallest you can do anyway. But you could say in a TND, if you're doing inclusionary, your minimum becomes 5 or becomes 5.5 or something like that, which doesn't sound like an incentive because it's a requirement, but it's an incentive because in the knowing when they go into the DRB that here's something that I'm told I have to do as a minimum it helps when they're considering all of the concerns that are raised about a project, and it gives them some assurance. And then if the whole thing gets appealed to the court, that they can say, well, I was told I have to do a minimum of 6 or whatever it is. And so, in whatever negotiations happen, they're given a guarantee. So it's a different way of thinking about an incentive, but that's another way to do it. So, think about what are the outcomes you're looking to achieve, and there's different tools to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul, could decreasing the minimum lot size, lot area be possible? I just don't have a sense of, like, for a single family, we have, as an example in the document you sent, 5,000. Yeah. I don't have a sense of, if we were really trying to do, tight clustered, so they're independent homes, but perhaps on a smaller lot footprint, yeah. What's even reasonable? Is 5,000 already pretty tight?
It's small. It's small for South Burlington, but I would say that in Queen City Park neighborhood, For example, homes are, there's some outliers, but I'd say that the majority of them are somewhere between 3,800 and 6,500 square feet, something like that. There's a couple that are on really teeny tiny lots and a few that have big ones, but that's an example of pretty, some small ones in a neighborhood that is, obviously it's got the lake, but is also very desirable as a neighborhood.
Well, plus we're adding all of the civic space and the park. So, I mean, I think that there's a parallel there. So maybe if there's a way to have inclusionary allow for that, that could help. Maybe?
Yeah, and as I said, I think that part of the offsets and incentives of inclusionary can be met just by the fact that you're doing PUDs, just by the fact that you've created these 5,000 square foot lots. We might tweak it a little bit for the rare chance that somebody does a PUD and doesn't hit the 12 unit threshold. But these are all things that can be adjusted a little bit to both accommodate the inclusionary and still achieve the type of neighborhood that you want. And we haven't talked about fees, but that's another piece of the puzzle that you could choose to recommend to the city council, that inclusionary units pay no fees, or no zoning permit fees. That's another incentive that can be considered, or that developments that have a minimum of X amount of inclusionary automatically go first in the review process. There's ways that that can be incentives that aren't just about the amount of development.
So all those things seem pretty good. What would be helpful from us, Paul? Do you want some straw polls? Do we want to adapt inclusionary zoning to the PUDs? That seems like one of your questions. Or what kind of feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so setting aside the question of expanding it just for a moment, within the areas where there's already inclusionary, in some manner, we're either going to have to adapt it or remove it to address the PUDs. And so I guess my assumption has been that you wanted to adapt it in the areas where it already applies. And I know that it's a little bit of work, but it's also what we've been preparing for this.
Okay, so that's lots of thumbs up. Okay, so it seems like that's a yes. There's a lot of thumbs.
The second question would be whether you're choosing to expand it in its geography. And I guess what I would say to that is, if you're ready to make a call on it now, that's fine. But it's also, since we're going to be doing the work outside of the in the areas where inclusion already applies, you can take a look at it and then decide. That doesn't change our workflow one way or the other.
So essentially what you're saying is the work to get it written up would be done either, because you're doing it for the areas it already applies, and maybe that would give us a good chance to think about how it might change what we're seeing if we applied it to other locations. Bernie?
Yeah, I was just going to say that what I would want to know is, basically advantages and disadvantages to doing that. I guess, my leaning is why not expand it? But then, I'm sure there's unintended consequences in both directions. So, if any information you could provide to, help fine tune that decision would be great.
Yeah, and Duncan?
So as it is now, we have inclusionary zoning in the transit overlay district, but elsewhere we have the affordable housing bonus. Yes. So two slightly different processes that give us a similar result. Did I hear that right?
I don't know that they allow a similar result. How about that? I don't know that they give you a similar result, but they allow a similar result.
To tap on what Bernie said, I guess I'd like to know what, it seems like it would make sense for us to have a fairly consistent approach citywide if what we're trying to do is to get more affordable or workforce housing. But I guess, like Bernie said, are there are there any unintended consequences that we didn't see coming down the line? So I didn't mean to repeat what Bernie said.
Yeah, so it sounds like if staff maybe had some pluses and minuses for expansion for the next time when we actually see language, that could be helpful. So I guess if anyone else had specific asks for that conversation, it looks like Paul, you wanted to address that?
I guess Ted gave some thoughts on some things that he would like to see incentivized. Are there others who have thoughts on, like, whether we're talking about inclusionary or we're just talking about the traditional neighborhoods to begin with? Are there others who have thoughts, or, you know, feel free to save this for your discussion next time when you sort of digest what Mark presented. But that's the thing I think next I'd love to get your feedback of, you know, what do you want to be incentivizing? And, you know, don't be bashful about thinking creatively about what you want to incentivize.
Ted, did you want to follow
Well,
up?
I just wanted to say that I agree with Monica that, you know, doing the dial of maybe having slightly less land to accommodate, that would be fine. But again, going back, I don't want to beat it, but, you know, the idea of cottage houses, family houses, I think is important.
Paul Engels?
Yeah, what is Article 18 then in relationship to this discussion?
So Article 18 is those two tools of affordability. So there's the inclusionary requirement, which says that if you're doing more than 12 homes in the transit area, Dorset Street, Kennedy Drive, Williston Road, Shelburne Road, that a portion of it has to be affordable. And then there's the other half of Article 18, which is the other parts of the city that allow for a density bonus as a option. So that's what Article 18 is the mechanisms for how those two affordable mechanisms work.
Well, it also addresses inclusionary zoning though, right?
Right, so that's the part in the transit area that you must do a certain portion of your development as affordable. It started in city center, and then last year was expanded to be to include Shelburne Road, Williston Road, Kennedy Drive area. So that's exactly.
We're talking about expanding it citywide then, right?
Possibly.
Refining Article 18 or?
Yeah, it would take some refinement to match it to the planned unit developments. And then if you chose to expand it citywide, we'd basically just delete the section on the affordable bonus. We wouldn't need that any longer. And you just have one set of standards. A lot of the work can be kept. It's really just about working through how to calculate sort of density differently. But most of the work that went into the inclusionary can be kept in terms of its characteristics and the what it means to be affordable, which was a lot of the heavy lifting that took place.
Okay, thanks.
Monica?
So, and to be clear, the calculator that you're going to be putting out to the public shows you the maximum that you can build. That maximum cannot accept a bonus, right? So
yes, except if you were to, so that again, it goes back to these radio dials. If you said that if the way that you made a bonus was to say you could be 5% more residential, then that changes the calculator. So instead of being a maximum of 80% residential, you make it 85, or your lot size goes down, as you were describing a few minutes ago, that changes the calculator. As the calculator as written does not assume that you're doing more with an inclusionary. It assumes that you'd come up with other tools.
But that's what I mean. So that with inclusionary, the calculator works, but with the other portion of Article 18, which is do that, oh, and you can get 50% more, that really doesn't work anymore. It becomes
Right.
becomes complicated.
Well, it
So
doesn't. It doesn't really work anymore because it's not about density. So you'd have to replace it with something else
Right.
if you chose to keep it. Period.
Okay. That's what I wanted to just hope. I would hope that that would come through to folks. Yeah. Thank you.
No, that was a really good point because it wasn't immediately clear that the bonus wouldn't work, but inclusionary would or could. So.
Right.
Anything else from commissioners or from the public on this item? Noting that it will be back on the agenda again once we have that kind of revised language. Okay, not.
Hey, Jessica.
Oh, Chris, and Chris is the chair of the Affordable Housing Committee. So.
I really appreciate everyone having this discussion, and if I understand there's a lot of questions of unintended and consequences. I think it'd be helpful if we could hear questions or concerns about what that is, and give us an opportunity to digest some of that feedback, and we can tap some of our resources to be helpful as well. I think any opportunity that we can better inform about why we've made this recommendation to expand that citywide. I think just the biggest thing is that we've seen that the market's not delivering to meet our goals now, and expanding the requirement for inclusionary will help us get there faster. But I just think if there's anything we can do to provide further clarity, we'd like to be a partner in that conversation. So thank you very much for getting this onto the agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you for the really detailed memo that you had provided us with as well. And Sandy Dooley.
I wanted to second what Chris said, and also just make the Planning Commission aware that due to sort of the sequencing of putting affordable units in South Village, the Ireland company is doing that now, and so they are doing affordable units, and they will, if not all, most of them will be home ownership. Plus, as Paul mentioned, the O'Brien brothers are doing the affordables in their new section of Hillside. Well, this is Hillside, I forget, or Eastview. But anyway, developers are getting some experience, and so we might even the committee might talk to some developers, because I have a feeling they might like to have one set of rules for affordable units under the PUDs as opposed to two, especially since I'm not really sure how the current density bonus situation, how that would be applied to your PUDs as you currently envision them. But basically, this has been a great meeting. I've learned so much, and I applaud all of you for all of your attention and work. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both. Ariel?
I'm actually a resident of South Village. And one of the things that I find very convenient is that the organic farm has actually a store that sells milk. And I think that in order to make an affordable community very accessible, it's important to be able to get things like groceries or at like a small grocery store near the house without having to get into the car. And I think that could really impact a lot people's life, because really carrying bags of groceries on a bus and then walking several blocks through the wind and snow, if you don't have a car, really can impact, people that can only afford one and have to share it with a family member or something like that. So I just wanted to just kind of include that as well. A small grocery or some kind of little commercial space like that could also serve as a community hub with a bulletin board and other things.
Great. Well, thanks. And I think Paul wanted to respond to that there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't want to prolong the meeting too much here, but thanks for the comment, Ariel. We were focused on the residential component tonight, but one of the features of the traditional neighborhood is that it allows for a small portion of the development to be non-residential, and it opens up the ability to have exactly what you're describing, which is there's a small handful of uses that otherwise would not be allowed, but become allowed as part of the PUD. Small retail, small restaurant. They've got a size cap with them so that you don't wind up with a price chopper in the middle of a residential neighborhood. But you could have something on the scale of the Mill Market or something like that, specifically for what you were for the reasons you were just describing.
Great. Paul Ingles, were you trying to get my attention? Were you? Okay. Anything else on this item? I know we do have the table of waivers / alternative development standards. I don't know how, and the meeting was scheduled till 8 or 9:15. So we do have a few more minutes if people want to get into that.
I didn't really have anything to present there. I know this was something that commissioners were interested in, so I really was just putting on the agenda in case folks wanted to talk about it or wanted to have a more dedicated discussion. But this tries to, in 2 pages, describe every place in the regulations where there's flexibility options.
Could we maybe?
I know the word waiver is used quite a bit, but in a lot of these cases, it's flexibility within very rigid bounds. Is that Bernie?
I was just going to suggest that maybe people take a little time to review it on their own and chew on it, and then maybe put it on, like 10 minutes at the beginning of the next meeting for just specific comments or concerns.
Yep, that's fine. I know we didn't want to go too late. Michael?
Some of the text in that is in red and some is not. What is the significance of that, Paul? In that table.
Yep,
Isn't it just?
I think that the only things in red are notes at the bottom. And I was just trying to make sure that they were not lost because it said things like legal review is not yet complete. So I just was doing it to make sure that it doesn't get read like the fine print of getting a cell phone contract where it's 85 pages that nobody reads.
Okay.
And
you also had a couple of reds in there, but it was mainly just explaining that you were going to continue to look at it, kind of thing.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. I missed that.
Sandy, you had something on this item?
Along the terms of what you were mentioning about the term waiver, I think the term waiver gives the wrong impression to people. As I read those, it's sort of carefully circumscribed discretion, because you can never write rules that anticipate every sort of formation of land or geology or whatever, and so there has to be some discretion, but it's not really sort of the sort of anything goes kind of situation that I think the word waiver connotes. So I'm not so sure I know of I'll maybe think about a better term, but I would encourage you to think about a different term from waiver, because it's not what I think of as a waiver.
Yeah, I think that was what I was trying to get at as well. Like some of these things where it says waiver, there's actually like very like a range. Anything else? So I guess going with Bernie's suggestion, we'll put this at the beginning of the next meeting so people can kind of chew on it before then. So I think the next thing was the schedule. Oh no, the next thing is actually the minutes. Do we have a motion about the minutes?
Move to approve January 26th and February 9th minutes.
And December 15th?
Sure, let's do that.
Okay, any discussion about the minutes? Okay, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
That was unanimous. Very good, thank you.
I'm voting against.
Oh, and Michael against.
I had a comment, but I wasn't quick enough. And the reason is that for us to read the minutes, it's probably understandable. But if I gave those minutes to my wife, for example, she would have no clue whatsoever what the Planning Commission is doing. There's a lot of feelings expressed and thoughts, but it doesn't really tell us what decisions were made, or what things were approved and what things were not approved. So I'm wondering whether the minutes are meant for the public to understand what we're doing, but I don't think a reading of them by an outsider, somebody who's not a commissioner, would understand what's going on. So that's why I wanted to hold up my vote for a moment, just to say this and see if there's any comment from any of.
My suggestion, Michael, and it's a fair point, and my suggestion would be, I know Jessica's been making a point to seek straw polls. It's very helpful for Sue when she's able to say 6 members said this and 1 said this as a straw poll. I know that it's a challenge for Sue to sort of get a sense of everyone without editorializing. So I guess I'd suggest to all commissioners, if there's something where you feel like we're at a decision point, to help Sue to do that by saying, let's take a moment and see where everybody is.
And, you know, it is actually a suggestion that Paul Engels had actually emailed to me that might help our meetings be kind of quicker, more decisive if we did some more motions. So, Paul or Bernie?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that also if we have specific action items that come out of any particular discussion, you know, maybe just a bolded action : Paul Connor will follow up with blah, 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 or, Jessica will do this or Bernie will do that, just so we know that there's a follow-up action that, or in the case of kind of the topic we just talked about, you could just say action, Planning Commission to review, it'll be on the agenda for next time, and that way, it's clear what we decided and who's got the ball and where it's going.
Michael, you're back to you.
Given that conversation, I can now join the majority and to approve the minutes.
Okay, so we're back to unanimous approving of minutes with some items we'll work on for future minutes. Okay, then schedule and deadlines. Monica, did you?
I'm sorry, I missed what the next step was on this principal components affecting though. Are we to come back to you with comments for next week? Like suggestions moving the 5,000 to 3,800 or?
Yes, so Paul's gonna actually email the calculator out, the Excel spreadsheet, and we'll work on it and we'll look at those ranges, maybe even refer back to the presentation where it actually shows different neighborhoods at different densities. And then we'll talk about the size of the lots and those radio dials he's kind of suggested along the side as well.
So that would be an action under that item.
Action item. Okay, so speaking of the next meeting, I put out the suggestion that over the next month or so we at least reserve time for each week, and maybe we wouldn't have a meeting each week, but it just feels like there's a lot of great ongoing discussion. There's a lot of material that's been provided by the consultants that we haven't gotten to yet. I think it might just show a good faith effort with kind of the requests from the City Council on our schedule. So Bernie?
Yeah, so 2 elements to that. One is I will make a motion to reserve Tuesdays at 7 from now until, what do you think, the middle of April? And then, so that's the first part of that. And then the second part of that is, so I guess let's do the first part of that first. So
it would be through to April the 27th, but the one Tuesday would become a Wednesday, which is March the 3rd instead of March the 2nd.
Okay, so because of town meeting day, I guess that's actually next week, it would be Wednesday.
Okay.
So
I'll
that's,
second the motion.
that's, I guess, maybe the amendment to the motion.
Okay.
It's amended, yes.
Okay, so with Michael's suggestions, any other discussion on the schedule? Paul?
Just to note that one of the things that Jessica noted in her email, a discussion of the I-89 corridor study, which is a really big project that's on a specific timeline. There is likely to be a Wednesday meeting for all committees in March, likely March 9th. So you may decide, sorry,
10th.
March 10th. So you,
It's a
yeah,
Thursday.
Wednesday.
I think you said it was Thursday.
Well, I guess
In
what
any
I would
case, so just
do
an FYI that you may adjust, once you see that schedule, you can choose to hold that regular meeting or not.
right. And so, my kind of motion is let's reserve Tuesdays. And then, like tonight we're wrapping up, we can say, okay, what do we want to do for next week? And if we stick to Tuesday, great. If we don't because of town meeting and we make it Wednesday, that's fine. But at least we've kind of reserved Tuesdays through the end of April. And then, we can revisit it each week. And so that was actually the second half of my thing, was if we agreed to the Tuesdays through the end of April, would be a question as to, what do we want to do for next week? So.
Right. Okay. We need to vote, I guess, right? Did we vote? Did I
No.
not? Okay. All in favor of the motion? Aye. That is unanimous.
Okay, and then the second part is what are we doing for next week? Are we going to meet next Wednesday? Do we need to meet next Wednesday?
Paul, I mean, I think there's a lot we can
I
talk.
think if you're ready to meet, I think that you could have a chunk of your meeting be exactly a follow-up from tonight. That is it's not a lot of additional prep work at my end. And Jessica and I can chat about whether there's anything else, but I think you can, right
So
there
the
would be.
spreadsheet, the table would be the two primary topics then.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
think
maybe
that's
a little
good
bit on
idea.
affordable housing.
And I sent a suggestion over to Paul and Jessica about something for a future meeting.
Yeah, perfect. And Michael?
Yes, I was just going to say, and I think it's implicit in what Bernie just said, that we should restrict these agendas to something that we can reasonably expect to be done in an hour and a half or 2 hours maximum.
Yeah, I'm going to do a better job with that. I do apologize for the last meeting putting the affordable housing thing at the end of the meeting.
It's not so much that you need to, it's doing something that we can start and finish at one meeting.
Yeah,
Yes.
Particularly on the special meetings, that's absolutely a good thing for sure.
Yeah, and I
All
am
meetings, but especially.
I'm going to really try to keep us to the 9 to 9:15, and that was part of it. I mean, I think there's just a lot to discuss, and it just didn't seem like it was going to fit into our regular meeting schedule. So
we're on for next Wednesday at 7. Is that where we're at this point? And we're going to talk about the table, the spreadsheet, and affordable housing.
yes,
A little bit.
Well, and I guess I'd say, and your reactions and thoughts about Mark's presentation generally. Yeah.
Okay.
very good. Well, thank you
Great.
all very much.
We have an
Thanks,
accord.
everyone.
We are adjourned. Bye.
Thank you.
Night, everybody.